In the year 1910, in a city where three empires met and mingled, a child was born who would build an empire of her own, not of territory or wealth, but of something far more enduring. Her name was Agnes Gonkshe Bojakshiu, and she entered the world in Skopje, a place where the Ottoman crescent still flew, where Albanian, Serbian, and Turkish voices filled the marketplace, where Orthodox churches stood alongside mosques and the occasional Catholic spire pierced the sky. Consider for a moment the peculiar timing of her arrival. The ancient Ottoman Empire, which had dominated southeastern Europe for 5 centuries, was entering its final convulsions. Within 3 years, the Balkan Wars would redraw every border. Within 8 years, the Great War would sweep away the old order entirely. Agnes was born into a world that was ending, though no one yet knew it. Her father, Nikola Bojakshiu, understood what was coming better than most. He was a merchant, successful enough, trading building materials and other goods across the Balkans. But he was also something more dangerous, a political man. He attended meetings that discussed Albanian independence, the fate of their people scattered across Ottoman territories, the future of a nation that did not yet exist. In Albanian culture, there is an ancient code called besa, a word that means both promise and honor, an unbreakable commitment to protect the vulnerable and keep one's word even unto death. Nikola lived by this code. The Bojakshiu family occupied a comfortable position in Skopje's small Catholic community. They were Albanian by ethnicity, Catholic by faith, Ottoman by circumstance, a precarious triangle of identities. Agnes's mother, Drana, managed their household with quiet efficiency, but there was steel beneath her gentleness. She insisted her children learn multiple languages. She brought them to Sacred Heart Church each morning, and she taught them, by example, that comfort carried obligations. Even as a young girl, Agnes would accompany her mother on visits to the poor, not the respectable poor who attended church and kept their difficulties private, but the genuinely destitute, the sick who had no one to care for them, the elderly abandoned by their families, the women without protection in a society that offered them none. Drana would bring food, medicine, whatever could be spared. She would clean wounds, prepare bodies for burial, sit with the dying, and Agnes watched. Imagine being 8 years old, accompanying your mother into rooms where death lingered, where the smell of unwashed bodies and sickness filled your nostrils, where people reached out with desperate gratitude for the smallest kindness. Most children would recoil. Agnes remembered. She saw how her mother's presence brought light into darkness, how a simple meal could restore dignity, how touch could heal isolation. Then came 1919, and everything changed. Nikola attended a political dinner in Skopje. The details remain murky even now, lost in the chaos of the post-war Balkans. What is known is this: he returned home violently ill, suffering seizures, bleeding internally. Within hours, he was dead. The official cause was listed as surgical complications, but Drana never believed it. Neither did Agnes. In a world where Albanian nationalism threatened the new Yugoslav state, where political activists disappeared or died mysteriously, where poison was a tool of statecraft, the timing was too convenient. Agnes was 9 years old. Her father's death was not just a personal tragedy, it was a strategic catastrophe. The family business collapsed without him. Their financial security evaporated. The comfortable middle-class existence vanished overnight. Here is where Drana's response becomes instructive. She could have returned to her family in defeat. She could have married again for security. She could have focused solely on survival. Instead, she made a choice that would echo through her daughter's future. She transformed their home into an extension of their mission. Drana took in embroidery work, making intricate Albanian designs for those who could afford them. She used the income not just to feed her 3 children, but to feed others. The Bojakshu home became a gathering place for those with nowhere else to go. Drana prepared meals for 6, 10, 12 people at a time. She took in lodgers who had no family. She created what we might now call a social enterprise, a business model that generated just enough resources to sustain both her family and her expanding charitable work. Agnes watched this transformation closely. She saw how her mother converted tragedy into purpose, how limited resources could be stretched through careful management and absolute commitment, how one woman with no official position or authority could become essential to her community. This was not abstract religious teaching. This was practical instruction in how to build something from nothing. The girl grew up serious, intense, with her mother's steel beneath a gentle exterior. She excelled in school, mastered languages with ease: Albanian, Serbian, French, and enough Italian to follow the Catholic liturgy. She joined the Sodality of the Blessed Virgin Mary at Sacred Heart Church, a group of young women dedicated to prayer and service. She read missionary magazines with fascination, learning about sisters working in India, Africa, and China, bringing education and healthcare to people who had neither. By the time Agnes reached 18, she had made her decision. She would become a nun. But not just any nun, she would become a missionary, would travel to those distant places she had read about, would build something that mattered. Her choice of religious order was, in retrospect, remarkably calculated. She did not join a local order that would keep her in the Balkans. She did not choose a contemplative community devoted to prayer and silence. Instead, she applied to the Sisters of Loreto, an Irish order that operated prestigious schools throughout British India. Think about what this represented. The Loreto sisters had developed a successful model. They educated the daughters of India's elite, wealthy Hindu and Muslim families who wanted English education and the social advantages it provided. The income from these schools funded missionary work among the poor. The sisters lived comfortably, not luxuriously, with guaranteed housing, food, and security within the British colonial system. For a young woman from a broken family in the struggling Balkans, this represented not just religious life, but career advancement, financial security, and guaranteed placement in one of the world's most dynamic regions. Agnes travelled first to Dublin in 1928, though she spent only weeks there learning basic English. The Loreto sisters recognized that her true work lay in India. By January 1929, she was on a ship crossing the Indian Ocean, watching the coastline emerge from the morning mist. She chose the name Sister Mary Teresa of the Child Jesus, after Thérèse of Lisieux, the young French Carmelite who had died just 30 years earlier and whose autobiography had become a Catholic sensation. It was good branding. Thérèse represented modern sanctity, the little way of doing small things with great love. The name aligned the young Albanian nun with a popular saint, suggesting both humility and spiritual ambition. Teresa spent her first months in Darjeeling, in the foothills of the Himalayas, completing her novitiate training. The Loreto order believed in thorough preparation. She studied teaching methods, school administration, and Catholic theology. But most importantly, she studied languages. She added English to her repertoire, making it fluent. She learned Hindi and Bengali, the languages of Calcutta's people. This linguistic strategy would prove crucial. It gave her tools for independent operation, the ability to communicate with India's poor without translators, without intermediaries. In 1931, Teresa took her first vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. She was 21 years old. She was assigned to Loreto's Entally community in eastern Calcutta, where she would teach at 2 schools: St. Mary's, a prestigious institution for wealthy Bengali girls, and an attached free school for poor children. For 17 years, Teresa taught geography and history. 17 years of lesson plans and examinations, 17 years of managing classrooms and dealing with teenage students, 17 years of the comfortable routine of convent life. To outsiders, she appeared destined for a conventional religious career, perhaps eventually becoming headmistress of one of the Loreto schools, perhaps serving until retirement, respected but unremarkable. But beneath this conventional surface, crucial developments were unfolding. Teresa was building networks. The wealthy Bengali families whose daughters she taught became her allies. They saw her dedication, her obvious intelligence, her genuine care for their children. When she would later need permissions, funding, and political support, these families would remember the young nun who had educated their daughters so well. She was also observing the operational model that sustained the Loreto order. She saw how the wealthy schools generated surplus revenue. She saw how this surplus funded charitable work without requiring constant fundraising. She understood the genius of this arrangement. Financial independence enabled mission focus. The sisters were not at the mercy of donors or government grants. They had created a self-sustaining system, and she was learning about Calcutta itself, a city of staggering contrasts. The British colonial capital of India, it was simultaneously one of the world's most sophisticated cities and one of its most desperate. Tree-lined boulevards led to elegant colonial buildings. But in the busties, the slums, hundreds of thousands lived in conditions almost beyond description. Families crowded into single rooms. Open sewers ran between dwellings. Cholera, tuberculosis, and malaria were simply facts of life. People died in the streets with such regularity that their bodies were collected each morning like refuse. The 1940s brought new horrors. In 1943, the Bengal famine killed between 2 and 3 million people. The British administration's wartime priorities, poor harvest, and policy failures combined to create catastrophe. Teresa, sheltered behind Loreto's walls, nonetheless saw the result: skeletal figures begging at the convent gates. Children abandoned because their families could no longer feed them, bodies carried past in endless procession. Then came 1946, the year of the Great Calcutta Killings. Hindu-Muslim riots, part of the approaching partition of India, turned the city into a battlefield. 4,000 people died in 3 days of communal violence. The streets ran with blood. Teresa and the other sisters were trapped in the convent, listening to the screams outside, smelling the smoke from burning buildings. It was in September of that year, on the 10th day of the month, that something happened that would change everything. Teresa was travelling by train from Calcutta to Darjeeling for her annual retreat. It was a long journey through the Bengali countryside, and somewhere during that journey, she experienced what she would later call her call within a call. The details of this experience remained largely private. She described it as hearing Christ speaking to her, calling her to leave the convent and work directly among the poorest of the poor. But whether mystical vision or profound psychological realization, the result was the same: absolute certainty about her purpose. Consider what she was contemplating. She was 36 years old. She had spent half her life in the secure embrace of the Loreto order. She had taken solemn vows that bound her to this community. She had no money, no independent resources, no organizational structure, and she was proposing to leave all this security to work among people who had nothing in one of the world's most challenging cities, with no clear plan beyond a sense of calling. Most people who have such moments of revelation do nothing about them. The practical obstacles are too great. The risks are too real. It is easier to interpret the calling as metaphor, to do more charity within existing structures, to satisfy the urge for meaning without upending one's entire life. But Teresa had been trained by Drana. She had watched her mother transform tragedy into mission. She had learned that you begin with what you have, even if that is nothing. She had absorbed the lesson that security is an illusion, that the only real security is found in absolute commitment to purpose. She began her campaign to make this vision real, and it would take her 2 full years of patient, strategic effort to obtain the permissions she needed. 2 years of writing letters to church authorities. 2 years of documenting exactly what she planned to do and why. 2 years of building alliances with sympathetic clergy who could advocate for her cause. 2 years of presenting herself as reliable, sensible, low risk already in India, already trained, already proven, requiring minimal institutional resources. The Catholic Church does not move quickly. It especially does not grant permissions quickly to nuns who wish to abandon their established communities and strike out independently. But Teresa understood how to work within the system. She emphasized that she was not rejecting religious life, merely answering a higher calling within it. She stressed that she would remain under church authority, working with the Archbishop of Calcutta rather than independently. She presented detailed observations of the need dying on the streets, the abandoned children, the lepers without care. She made her case with the precision of a lawyer arguing before a court, and finally, in 1948, the Vatican granted permission. Sister Teresa was given a rare indult of exclaustration permission to live outside her religious community while remaining a nun. The Archbishop of Calcutta, Ferdinand Perrier, agreed to become her ecclesiastical superior. She could leave the security of Loreto and begin. She was 38 years old. She had 5 rupees in her pocket, perhaps half a dollar in current terms. She had no house, no organization, no followers. She had her mother's training, 17 years of observation and network building, an absolute certainty of purpose. The empire of compassion was about to begin. There is a moment in every great enterprise when vision must meet reality. For Teresa, that moment came on August 16th, 1948, when she stepped out of the Loreto convent gates, wearing a white sari with blue border and nothing else. No plan, no followers, no infrastructure. Just 5 rupees and an address. The address belonged to the Medical Mission Sisters in Patna, 250 miles north of Calcutta. If Teresa was to work among the sick poor, she needed medical training. For 4 months, she learned basic nursing, how to clean wounds, administer injections, deliver babies, recognize symptoms of tuberculosis and cholera. She learned which diseases could be treated with simple interventions and which required hospitalization. She learned, crucially, what could be done with almost nothing. When she returned to Calcutta in December, the city was still reeling from the aftermath of partition. The previous year, British India had been divided into India and Pakistan, splitting Bengal in 2. Millions of Hindu refugees had fled from East Pakistan into West Bengal. Calcutta, already overcrowded, had absorbed perhaps 1 million desperate people. They lived wherever they could on railway platforms, in makeshift camps, on the streets themselves. The colonial administration was withdrawing. The British officers who had run social services were departing. The new Indian government, barely a year old, was overwhelmed with the basic challenges of governing a new nation of 350 million people. There was no bandwidth for the most marginal, the most desperate, the people who fell through every crack in every system. This was the gap Teresa had identified. Consider the social structure of India in 1948. Hindu charities served Hindus, organized by caste and community. Muslim charities served Muslims, organized by family networks and religious obligations. Christian missions served Christians and potential converts. The British had established some hospitals and poorhouses, but these were now in chaotic transition. Each system had its boundaries, its criteria for who deserved help. But there existed a category of people who fit nowhere. The dying found on streets with no identification, no family, no religion anyone could identify. The mentally ill who wandered until they collapsed. The lepers, literally untouchable in Hindu culture, excluded from Muslim communities, too numerous for Christian missions. The children abandoned at birth, left at railway stations or garbage heaps because their mothers had no other choice. The elderly without families in a society where family was everything. These were the people no one claimed, and Teresa claimed them all. She began in the bustis, the slums that sprawled across eastern Calcutta. She had no building, so she gathered children under a tree. She had no chalk or blackboards, so she used sticks to write letters in the dirt. She had no chairs, so everyone sat on the ground. She taught them Bengali letters, basic arithmetic, and hygiene, how to wash hands, why boiled water mattered, how to prevent infection. The children came because no one else offered them anything. Their parents, if they had parents, worked endless hours as day labourers, rickshaw pullers, domestic servants. Education was a luxury they could not afford, but this strange woman in the white sari charged nothing, demanded nothing except attention. She learned their names, she noticed when they were absent, she brought medicine when they were sick. Word spread through the busties with remarkable speed. By January of 1949, Teresa was teaching dozens of children. By February, she had more students than she could manage alone. And then something crucial happened. In March, one of her former students from St. Mary's School appeared at the slum where Teresa taught. Her name was Subhasini Das. She was from a wealthy Bengali family. She had been educated at Loreto, had every advantage, every opportunity, and she told Teresa she wanted to join her work. Think about what this represented. Subhasini was not a nun. She had no religious vows binding her to poverty and service. She was choosing to leave comfort for the busties, cleanliness for filth, security for uncertainty. She was the first confirmation that Teresa's vision was not madness, that others could see what she saw. Within weeks, more former students appeared. They came tentatively at first, spending afternoons helping with the children, then full days, then moving into the small rooms Teresa had rented above the Gomes family home on Creek Lane. These were young Bengali women, mostly Hindu, drawn by something they could not quite articulate, a sense of purpose, perhaps, or simply the magnetic pull of Teresa's absolute commitment. By June, there were 10 of them. By September, 15. Teresa taught them what she had learned in Patna basic nursing, how to recognize disease, how to comfort the dying, but she also taught them something else, the discipline of poverty. She insisted they wear the same white sari she wore, not as a uniform exactly, but as a statement: we are one of you, we own nothing, we claim no superiority. The sari cost less than 2 rupees. It could be washed by hand and dried in an hour. It marked them as different from every other religious order in India, which wore European-style habits that immediately identified them as foreign. This was strategic brilliance masked as spiritual simplicity. The white sari was the traditional dress of Bengali widows, women without status or protection, dependent on charity. By adopting it, Teresa and her followers positioned themselves as humble, as Indian, as servants rather than saviors. They could move through the busties without attracting attention or resentment. They were not European missionaries bringing foreign religion, but sisters. The Bengali word they used, Didi, meant both sister and elder female relative who happened to be Catholic. The poverty Teresa demanded was not symbolic. She insisted on sleeping on thin mats on the floor, eating the simplest dal and rice, owning only 3 saris, one to wear, one to wash, one to mend. They bathed using buckets of cold water. They owned no personal possessions beyond basic clothing and a crucifix. This was partly spiritual discipline, following Christ's example of radical poverty, but it was also practical calculation. By living exactly as the people they served lived, By experiencing the same discomforts and indignities, they built trust impossible to achieve otherwise. The poor knew that these women had chosen to live this way, that they gained nothing material from their work. This made them trustworthy in ways that well-fed, well-housed missionaries could never be. And the financial implications were profound. Teresa's operating costs were almost zero. Food cost perhaps 2 rupees per person per month. Housing was whatever they could rent cheaply or was donated. Medical supplies were basic and inexpensive. There were no salaries, no pensions, no retirement benefits. Every rupee donated went directly to serving the poor, not to maintaining institutional infrastructure. By late 1949, Teresa needed official recognition. She was still technically a member of the Loreto Order, working with borrowed authority. To build something permanent, she needed to found a new religious congregation with Vatican approval. She drafted a rule, the document that would govern this new community. It was remarkably simple. The sisters would take traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they would add a 4th vow, to give wholehearted free service to the poorest of the poor. They would refuse all payment for their work. They would accept any suffering or difficulty. They would go anywhere they were needed, live in any conditions, serve anyone regardless of caste, religion, or circumstance. The rule required absolute obedience to the superior General Teresa herself. It required living in community, praying together, eating together, working together. It prohibited any personal funds, any inheritance, any financial independence. Once a woman joined, she owned nothing and would own nothing for the rest of her life. This level of control might seem extreme, but it served a purpose. Teresa was building not just a charity, but a movement. She needed absolute consistency. If different communities interpreted the rule differently, if standards varied by location, the entire enterprise would fragment. By demanding total obedience and total poverty, she ensured that a Missionaries of Charity house in Calcutta would operate exactly like one in Rome or New York or Manila. On October 7th, 1950, the Archbishop of Calcutta officially established the Missionaries of Charity as a diocesan congregation. Teresa was 39 years old. She had 12 followers, no building of her own, and a vision that most people considered impractical at best, delusional at worst. She needed a permanent home. The Gomes family had been generous, but their house was too small. Teresa was searching for options when opportunity knocked in an unexpected way. Michael Gomes, her landlord's son, mentioned that a large house at number 54 Lower Circular Road was available. The Muslim family that owned it was emigrating to Pakistan, part of the ongoing population exchange following partition. The house was substantial, 3 stories, multiple rooms, a courtyard. It was also expensive. Teresa went to look anyway. She had perhaps 100 rupees in donations at that point, nowhere near enough for even a deposit. But as she walked through the empty rooms, she felt certainty. This was where they needed to be. She prayed, and then she did something that would become her signature move. She approached someone with resources and made her case. The owner agreed to rent the house for a nominal sum, moved by Teresa's obvious sincerity, or perhaps simply relieved to have tenants. Local benefactors, including some of the Bengali families whose daughters Teresa had taught at Loreto, contributed toward the first year's rent. By February 1951, the Missionaries of Charity had their mother house. Now Teresa could build systematically. The house became both home and headquarters. The ground floor served as a free dispensary where the poor could receive basic medical care. The upper floors housed the growing community of sisters. They established a routine that would continue for decades, rising at 4:40 in the morning for prayer, mass at 6:45, breakfast, then out to work in the busties until lunch, more work in the afternoon, evening prayer, dinner, bed by 10. Thursday became their day of rest, not Sunday, which was just another workday in predominantly Hindu Calcutta. On Thursdays, they did laundry, mended their saris, rested, and spent extra time in prayer. This rhythm created sustainability in work that could otherwise consume everything. The work was expanding. Teresa and her sisters were now finding dying people on the streets and bringing them to the dispensary. They would wash them, dress their wounds, feed them if they could eat, sit with them as they died. They recovered abandoned infants and cared for them at the mother house. They visited leper colonies on the city's outskirts, bringing medicine and comfort. But Teresa recognized that what they were doing was insufficient. They needed specialized facilities for specialized needs. You cannot properly care for the dying in a room also used as a dispensary and classroom. You cannot care for infants alongside dying adults. You need separate spaces, each designed for its purpose. In 1952, she heard about an abandoned building next to the Kalihat temple, dedicated to the Hindu goddess Kali. The building had been a pilgrim's rest house, but had fallen into disrepair. It was in a terrible state, filthy, structurally damaged, filled with refuse. It was also perfectly located. Kalihat was one of Calcutta's most important Hindu pilgrimage sites. Thousands came daily to worship at the temple, and many pilgrims, especially poor ones who had travelled great distances, fell sick or died during their journey. The streets around Kalihat were where the dying accumulated, where bodies were carried to the burning ghats on the Hooghly River. Teresa approached the city government with a proposal: give her the building, and she would create a home for the dying. She would take people off the streets, give them clean beds, food, medical care, and dignity in death. She would charge nothing and would accept anyone, regardless of religion. The city officials were skeptical but had little to lose. The building was useless in its current state, and the problem of dying people on the streets near a major religious site was real. In August 1952, they granted permission. Teresa and her sisters spent weeks cleaning. They scrubbed floors, hauled away garbage, repaired walls and roof, whitewashed everything. They built simple, wooden cots, dozens of them, packed close together. They installed a basic kitchen. They created a space that was clean and peaceful, if Spartan. On August 22, 1952, Nirmal Hriday, meaning pure heart or immaculate heart, opened its doors. The sisters went out to the streets and brought back their first patients. A woman dying of tuberculosis, a man with advanced cancer, an elderly person abandoned by family. They washed them, gave them clean clothes, fed them, spoke gently, treated them as human beings rather than refuse. Some survived, many died, but they died with dignity, with someone holding their hand, with their suffering acknowledged rather than ignored. Hindu patients received water from the Ganges. Muslims heard prayers from the Quran. Christians received last rites. Everyone received basic human compassion in their final hours. The location at Kaligat Temple turned out to be strategically perfect. The irony was not lost on anyone. Kali is the goddess of death and destruction in Hindu mythology, often depicted with a garland of skulls and a sword dripping blood. And here, in a building literally on her doorstep, Christian nuns were caring for the dying with radical gentleness. Some Hindu priests initially objected to Christian missionaries operating so close to the temple, but their objections faded when they saw what was actually happening. The nuns were not preaching, not converting, not disrespecting Hindu practices. They were simply caring for people who had no one else. And when those people died, the nuns ensured their bodies were treated according to their own religious traditions. Hindus were prepared for cremation, Muslims for burial, Christians for Christian funeral rites. This respect for religious differences while maintaining Catholic identity would become a hallmark of Teresa's approach. She was building bridges, not demanding religious conversion as the price of care. By 1953, the missionaries of charity were operating multiple programs: the free school in the Busties, the dispensary at the Mother House, Nirmal Hriday for the dying, and a growing number of sisters trained in this radical model of service. Teresa's strategy was proving viable. Starting with nothing but conviction, she had built an organization that served real needs in ways no one else was addressing. She had identified the gaps in the existing social service network and filled them. She had created an operational model based on minimal costs and maximum impact. She had recruited followers who shared her vision and would work without payment, and she was just beginning. The empire of compassion had established its first territories. The model was proven. Now came the question of scale. How do you take something that works in one city and replicate it across a subcontinent, across a world? Teresa already had ideas about that. There is a principle in nature that successful organisms replicate. A single seed becomes a tree, which produces thousands of seeds, which become a forest. But replication requires more than fertility. It requires a stable template, a reliable pattern that can reproduce itself across different environments while maintaining its essential character. By 1954, Teresa faced precisely this challenge. Her model worked in Calcutta, but how do you ensure that a Missionaries of Charity house in Delhi operates with the same principles, the same standards, the same spirit as the original? How do you maintain quality control when you cannot personally oversee every location? Her solution was to build the DNA of her vision into every cell of the organization. The rule she had written was not merely a document, it was an operating system. Every sister, in every location, would rise at the same hour. They would pray the same prayers. They would wear the same sari. They would own nothing. They would eat the same simple food. They would follow the same daily rhythm. This was not about controlling individual lives, though it certainly did, that it was about creating perfect consistency. Consider what happens when you remove all variables except mission. If sisters cannot decide their own schedules, or choose their own clothing, or manage personal funds, or make individual decisions about assignments, then they can focus entirely on the work. There are no internal debates about lifestyle, no competition over resources, no personal agenda beyond service. Everyone becomes interchangeable parts in a machine designed for a single purpose. This required absolute central authority. Teresa maintained complete control over assignments, admissions, and policy. She decided which sisters went where, which projects to undertake, which opportunities to accept or decline. Local superiors managed daily operations, but major decisions flowed through her. Some would call this authoritarian. Teresa would call it necessary. She had seen religious communities fragment over differences in interpretation, watched charitable organizations lose their way as founders' visions diluted across generations. She was building something designed to outlast her, which meant the blueprint had to be so clear, so detailed, so embedded in practice that it would continue automatically. The recruitment strategy evolved with sophistication. Teresa needed a specific type of person, young enough to be formed, educated enough to be effective, resilient enough to endure hardship, and willing to surrender all autonomy. She found these women primarily among middle-class Indian families, daughters who had received education, who had options, but who felt called to something more meaningful than comfortable domesticity or clerical work. The application process was deliberately challenging. Candidates spent months as aspirants, living with the community before making any commitment. They experienced the 4:40 morning wake-up, the bucket baths, the mat on the floor, sleeping, the work in the Busties. Many left. Those who remained entered the postulancy, receiving the white sari and beginning formal training. After 2 years, they could take temporary vows, After 6 more years, they would take final vows, a lifetime commitment. This extended timeline served multiple purposes. It allowed both the candidate and the community to assess fit. It gave time for romantic or idealistic notions to fade, replaced by clear-eyed understanding of what this life actually entailed. And it created a pipeline at any given time. There were aspirants, postulants, and sisters at various stages of formation, ensuring continuous renewal. By the mid-1950s, the missionaries of charity were receiving more applications than they could accept. This was partly due to Teresa's growing reputation, but also because she offered something rare: absolute purpose, total commitment, complete clarity about what mattered. In a newly independent India still finding its identity, where traditional roles were shifting but new opportunities remained limited for many women, Teresa provided an alternative that was demanding but meaningful. The expansion of services within Calcutta revealed strategic thinking about portfolio diversification. Each facility addressed a specific unmet need, and each operated on the same zero-cost to patients model. Nirmal Friday served the dying, those found on streets, brought by family members who could not care for them, or referred by hospitals that had nothing more to offer. By 1955, thousands had passed through its doors. Survival rate was perhaps 30%, which sounds terrible until you understand that these were people already dying when they arrived. The other 70% died with dignity, which was the entire point. But what about the survivors? The children recovered from garbage heaps, the infants left at railway stations. In 1955, Teresa opened Shishu Bhavan, meaning Children's Home at the Mother House. This facility cared for abandoned children, orphans, and infants whose mothers had no means to raise them. The sisters fed them, treated their illnesses, and eventually arranged adoptions or foster placements. Shishu Bhavan operated on a simple principle: every child deserves life and love. Gender did not matter in a society that often devalued female infants. The sisters took all children equally. Caste did not matter. Religion did not matter. Health did not matter. They accepted children with disabilities, with diseases, with conditions that made them unadoptable by conventional standards. The adoption program became self-sustaining through an elegant mechanism. Wealthy Indian families, and later international families, wanted to adopt healthy infants. The fees they paid, though modest, helped support care for children no one wanted. This created a financial ecosystem where desirable adoptions subsidized comprehensive care. Then came the lepers. Leprosy occupied a unique position in Indian society, not merely a disease but a source of ritual pollution in Hindu culture, a mark of divine punishment in popular belief, and a source of such profound social stigma that diagnosis meant complete social death. Lepers were driven from their families, their villages, their communities. They lived in colonies on the edges of cities, begging for survival, with no access to medical care and no hope of reintegration. In 1957, Teresa learned that the government planned to evict a leper colony because the land was needed for development. Hundreds of people would be displaced with nowhere to go. She responded with characteristic directness. If the government would not help them, she would. She approached pharmaceutical companies and obtained donated medicines, primarily dapsone, a sulfur drug that could arrest leprosy's progression if administered consistently. She trained sisters in how to clean and dress the wounds that leprosy caused, how to prevent infection, how to provide basic care, and she established mobile clinics that traveled to leper colonies, bringing treatment directly to people who could not come to hospitals. This was strategically brilliant. By going to the lepers rather than asking them to come to her, Teresa avoided the problem of stigma preventing treatment. By providing free medicine and care, she removed financial barriers. By training lepers themselves to become health workers, distributing medicine and basic care within their communities, she created sustainability and restored dignity. These were no longer merely recipients of charity, but participants in their own healing. In 1958, she purchased land at Titagarh, outside Calcutta, and established Shanti Nagar, meaning City of Peace. This was not a treatment facility, but a rehabilitation community where lepers who had been treated could learn trades, earn income, and rebuild lives. They made bandages, which the missionaries of charity could use in their medical work. They learned carpentry, weaving, and other skills. They lived in dignity rather than isolation. The theological implications were profound, though Teresa rarely articulated them explicitly. In Hindu understanding, leprosy represented karmic punishment for sins in previous lives. By treating lepers with respect and affection, by touching them when others would not, by insisting they had value and deserved care, Teresa was making a radical statement about human worth that transcended caste and karma. Each of these programs, Nirmal Hriday, Shishu Bhavan, Shanti Nagar, operated on the same financial model. Accept no payment from those served, rely on donations from those able to give, maintain minimal operating costs through sister labor and radical simplicity. This model had significant advantages. It was scalable, it created no financial barriers to service, and it allowed rapid response to need without waiting for funding, approval. But it also created dependencies and limitations. The quality of care was basic clean bedding, simple food, basic medicine, compassionate presence. It was not advanced medical treatment, not comprehensive social services, not systemic solution to poverty. It was triage, emergency response, dignity in crisis. And Teresa was unapologetic about this. She was not trying to replace hospitals or solve poverty's root causes. She was trying to ensure that no one died alone and unloved in the streets of Calcutta. The political dimension of her work was carefully managed. India in the 1950s was navigating a precarious path, newly independent, deeply poor, officially secular but predominantly Hindu, led by Jawaharlal Nehru's Congress Party, with its vision of socialist development. Foreign missionaries were viewed with suspicion as potential agents of Western influence. The government had already restricted visas for new missionaries and was considering further limitations. Teresa's strategy was to become indispensable while appearing politically neutral. She cultivated relationships with Bengal's chief ministers, regardless of party. She invited politicians to visit her facilities, letting them see the work firsthand. She accepted government recognition when offered in 1962. She received the Padma Shri, one of India's highest civilian awards, but never lobbied for such recognition. She was also careful about religious messaging. The missionaries of charity were explicitly Catholic, prayed Catholic prayers, attended Catholic Mass. But in their work, they did not proselytize. There was no requirement to convert to receive care, no religious instruction given to Hindu or Muslim patients, no attempt to baptize the dying without consent. This restraint was both ethical and strategic. It allowed her to operate in a multi-religious society without triggering backlash from Hindu nationalists or Muslim leaders. When conversions did happen, and they did, occasionally they were presented as individual choices freely made, not organizational objectives. This nuanced position allowed Teresa to maintain both Catholic identity and social legitimacy. The media dimension began almost accidentally but quickly became crucial. In 1958, a British journalist named Malcolm Muggeridge visited Calcutta researching a piece on India. Someone mentioned Mother Teresa's work, and Muggeridge, more curious than convinced, went to see Nirmal Hriday. What he found challenged his considerable cynicism. Here was a small Albanian nun, working in appalling conditions, with virtually no resources, treating people whom society had completely discarded, and doing so with evident joy. The sisters sang as they cleaned wounds. They smiled at patients who could not smile back, They seemed genuinely content in circumstances that should have produced despair. Muggeridge wrote about this encounter, and something in his description captured attention. He portrayed Teresa not as a professional charity administrator, but as a mystic, a saint walking among the living, proof that divine grace could manifest in human form. This framing, intentional or not, would shape all future coverage. Teresa recognized the opportunity. She allowed photographers into her facilities. She gave interviews. She was quotable, speaking in simple, direct language about love and service. Do not think that love, in order to be genuine, has to be extraordinary, she would say. What we need is to love without getting tired. She understood that visibility attracted resources. Every article about her work brought donors. Every photograph of sisters caring for dying people generated contributions. She was building a brand, though she would never use that language. The brand was radical love in action, sanctity visible, proof that one person can make a difference. By 1960, the missionaries of charity had expanded beyond Calcutta. The first new foundation was in Ranchi, a city 500 kilometers northwest, then Delhi, then Mumbai. Each new house followed the same pattern: a small group of sisters, a simple residence, immediate service to the poorest available, operating on minimal resources while building local donor networks. The expansion revealed both the genius and the limitations of Teresa's model. The genius, extreme simplicity, meant rapid deployment. A new house could be established in weeks rather than years. The sisters needed only a basic building, some mats to sleep on, cooking pots, and medical supplies. They could begin work immediately. The limitation: quality control required constant vigilance. Teresa traveled extensively to visit each house, ensure standards were maintained, address problems, and reinforce the vision. As the number of houses grew, this became increasingly challenging. She needed mechanisms to maintain consistency without personal presence. Her solution was the formation program. Every sister, regardless of which house she would eventually join, received identical training at the mother house in Calcutta. They learned not just the skills teaching, nursing, administration, but the culture. They absorbed the daily rhythms, the prayer practices, the approach to service. They learned by doing alongside experienced sisters. By the time they were assigned to a new location, they carried the template in their minds and bodies. She also instituted regular reports and visits. Each house sent monthly reports detailing activities, challenges, and needs. Teresa or her designated representatives visited regularly, observing operations, correcting deviations, offering guidance. This created accountability without bureaucracy. Houses maintained autonomy in daily decisions, but operated within clear parameters. The organizational structure was deliberately simple. At the top was Teresa, the superior general, with absolute authority. Below her were regional superiors, overseeing multiple houses. Below them were local superiors managing individual houses. Below them were the sisters doing the actual work. This hierarchy was clear, with defined reporting lines, and no confusion about who decided what. This simplicity had advantages. Decisions could be made quickly. There was no internal democracy to slow response. Resources flowed to where Teresa judged they were most needed, not where internal lobbying was most effective. The organization could pivot rapidly when opportunities arose or circumstances changed. It also created vulnerabilities. Everything depended on Teresa's judgment. If she made poor decisions, there were no checks. If she became ill or died, succession was uncertain. The organization was highly efficient but not resilient. It was optimized for founder-led growth, not institutional longevity. But in 1960, these vulnerabilities seemed distant. Teresa was 50 years old, in good health, and building momentum. The Missionaries of Charity had grown from 12 sisters in 1950 to over 100 by 1960. They operated in a dozen cities. They served thousands of people daily. They had proven that their model worked, and they had attracted the attention of the Catholic Church hierarchy. In 1965, Pope Paul VI granted the Missionaries of Charity status as a pontifical congregation, meaning they now operated under Vatican authority rather than just diocesan authority. This was a significant upgrade. It meant Teresa could establish houses anywhere in the world without requiring local bishop approval. It meant canonical protection and official recognition. It meant the little diocesan congregation from Calcutta had become a global order. The Empire of Compassion had become official. The template was proven. The organization was structured. The expansion would now accelerate beyond anything Teresa had initially imagined. But with growth came new challenges. How do you maintain the first spirit of radical poverty while managing international operations? How do you stay focused on the poorest of the poor while navigating relationships with wealthy donors and powerful politicians? How do you remain prophetic while becoming institutional? These questions would define the next phase of Teresa's journey. The small operation that began with 5 rupees and 12 sisters was becoming a global enterprise. The Albanian nun who taught street children under a tree was becoming an international figure. The simplicity that had been her greatest strength would now be tested by complexity. The architecture of compassion was built. Now it needed to stand the test of scale. There comes a moment in the life of any successful enterprise when it must ask a fundamental question. Does our model work only here, or does it work everywhere? Is what we have built a response to local conditions, or have we discovered something universal? For Teresa, that question was answered in 1965 when she received permission to establish her first house outside India. The location she chose was revealing. Venezuela, a country in South America with virtually no connection to Calcutta, no shared language, no cultural similarities, no obvious reason why a model designed for Indian slums would translate. And yet it did. The Missionaries of Charity arrived in Cocorote, a poor rural area, wearing their white saris in a land of Spanish speakers and Catholic traditionalists. They knew no Spanish. They had no local contacts. They had minimal funding. They applied the same template: find the poorest, live among them, serve with nothing except compassionate presence. Within months, they were integrated into the community. Local women joined them. Donations materialized. The work expanded. The model proved portable. This was the proof Teresa needed. If the Missionaries of Charity could function in Venezuela as effectively as in Calcutta, they could function anywhere. Poverty was universal. Abandonment was universal. The need for dignity and suffering was universal. And a system built on radical simplicity could adapt to any environment. But Venezuela was still peripheral, still safe. The real test of ambition came in 1968, when Teresa opened a house in Rome itself, the heart of the Catholic Church, the seat of papal authority, the center from which all Catholic missionary activity theoretically flowed. Think about what this represented strategically. By establishing presence in Rome, Teresa positioned herself at the nexus of ecclesiastical power. She could meet with Vatican officials regularly. She could build relationships with cardinals who advised the Pope. She could influence decisions about missionary permissions, about resource allocation, about which religious orders received recognition and support. She could also attract Italian donors, people with wealth who could see the work firsthand, who could visit the Rome house and then fund operations in Calcutta or Nairobi or wherever Teresa needed resources. Rome was not just a symbolic conquest, it was a strategic command center, and the Pope himself took notice. Pope Paul VI had already granted the Missionaries of Charity pontifical status. Now he began meeting with Teresa personally, becoming not just a formal superior but an active supporter. This relationship provided protection from critics within the Church, who questioned whether this order of mostly non-European sisters, working in unorthodox ways, truly represented Catholic mission. The international expansion accelerated through the late 1960s and early 1970s. Each new country followed a pattern. Teresa identified need, obtained permissions, sent a small team of experienced sisters, established operations using the proven model, recruited local women, built donor networks, then moved to the next location. But the truly audacious move came in 1971 when Teresa opened a house in New York City. New York was not Rome. Rome was Catholic, traditional, expected missionaries. New York was secular, skeptical, sophisticated, and wealthy. It was the media capital of the world, the financial center of global capitalism, a city that prided itself on being post-religious, post-traditional, post-everything. And Teresa was bringing her 1950s Indian poverty model to the South Bronx. The South Bronx in 1971 was burning literally. Landlords were setting fire to unprofitable buildings to collect insurance. Heroin addiction was epidemic. Gangs controlled entire neighborhoods. The city was nearly bankrupt. Middle-class residents were fleeing to suburbs. The area looked like a war zone. Into this environment came sisters in white saris, speaking with Indian accents, offering to serve the poorest with no government funding and no institutional backing beyond their own determination. Most observers thought they would last weeks before reality forced retreat. They are still there. The New York Foundation was strategic genius. By demonstrating that poverty existed even in wealthy America, that the missionaries of charity could address it, Teresa expanded her donor base exponentially. She was no longer merely serving India's poor, she was serving the global poor, including the poor in donors' own countries. American donors could now visit a missionaries of charity house without traveling to Calcutta. They could see sisters caring for AIDS patients in Harlem, serving in soup kitchens in Brooklyn, working with homeless families in the Bronx. They could see that their donations were funding work in their own city, as well as abroad. This made giving more tangible, more emotionally resonant, more likely. The media attention multiplied. American newspapers loved the story. Nuns in saris serving in the South Bronx was irresistible copy. Television crews documented the work. The contrast between the sisters' simplicity and New York's complexity, between their poverty and America's wealth, between their faith and modern secularism, created narrative tension that journalists could not resist. And Teresa, who had learned media management in Calcutta, was now operating on the global stage. She gave interviews that were quotable and profound. She spoke simply, avoiding jargon, offering memorable phrases. The poverty in the West is a different kind of poverty. It is not only a poverty of loneliness, but also of spirituality. There is a hunger for love, as there is a hunger for God. She was reframing poverty as not merely material deprivation, but spiritual emptiness. This message resonated in wealthy countries where material abundance coexisted with epidemic depression, addiction, and suicide. She was saying, you too are poor in ways that matter, and we can serve that poverty as well. The fundraising strategy evolved in sophistication while maintaining surface simplicity. Teresa's public position was that she never asked for money, that God provided through mysterious means, that donors appeared when needed without solicitation. This was spiritually appealing. It suggested divine approval and removed the distasteful element of aggressive fundraising. The reality was more complex. Teresa did not send fundraising letters or employ professional development staff, but she did cultivate relationships with wealthy individuals and institutions. She accepted invitations to speak at events organized by potential donors. She allowed journalists and photographers access, knowing that positive coverage generated contributions. She wrote letters to benefactors thanking them for support and subtly mentioning current needs. This indirect approach had advantages. It maintained an image of purity, the saint who trusted in providence rather than marketing. It attracted donors who were repelled by conventional charity appeals. And it created mystique. People wanted to be part of this miraculous enterprise where money appeared as needed. The financial model, however, created problems that would haunt the organization for decades. Teresa insisted on accepting all donations without questions about source or conditions. If a dictator wanted to donate, she accepted. If a corporation with questionable practices offered funds, she accepted. If wealthy individuals of dubious reputation contributed, she accepted. Her logic was straightforward. The money would serve the poor regardless of where it came from. Refusing donations because donors were imperfect would mean helping fewer people. And who was she to judge others' morality? God could transform any gift into good works. Critics saw this differently. By accepting money from corrupt politicians, arms dealers, or fraudulent businessmen, they argued, Teresa was providing them with moral legitimacy. She was allowing them to launder reputations through association with her sanctity. And she was compromising her prophetic voice. How could she speak truth to power when she depended on power's generosity? Teresa's response was pragmatic rather than principled. She avoided discussing donors publicly. She never disclosed financial details. She maintained that the missionaries of charity's accounts were no one's business except their own. This opacity prevented scrutiny, but also prevented learning from or improving financial practices. The expansion through the 1970s was remarkable in scope and speed. By 1975, the missionaries of charity operated in dozens of countries across 5 continents. Each year brought new foundations: Australia, Ethiopia, Jordan, Yemen, Papua New Guinea, Mexico, the Philippines. Teresa seemed to sleep only on airplanes, traveling constantly to establish new houses, visit existing ones, meet with church leaders, and accept awards that generated publicity. The awards were multiplying. She received the Templeton Prize for Progress in Religion in 1973, $140,000, which she immediately directed to building a leprosarium. She received the PASM in Terrace Peace and Freedom Award in 1972. She received the Albert Schweitzer International Prize in 1975. Each award brought media coverage, speaking opportunities, and credibility with potential donors. But the relationship with Malcolm Muggeridge proved most consequential. After writing about Teresa in 1958, Muggeridge had remained fascinated. In 1969, he convinced the BBC to produce a documentary about her work. He travelled to Calcutta with a film crew to create Something Beautiful for God. The documentary included a scene that became almost mythical. The crew wanted to film inside Nirmal Hriday, but the building's interior was very dark, too dark for the film stock they had. They shot anyway, not expecting usable footage. When they developed the film, the interior shots were inexplicably well lit, clear, and beautiful. Muggeridge declared it a miracle, literally divine intervention to reveal God's work through Teresa. Skeptics noted that Kodak had recently introduced new high-speed film stock that the crew had used experimentally, which explained the unexpected clarity. But Muggeridge's interpretation dominated. The idea that filming Teresa's work produced miracles became part of her mystique. The documentary aired in 1969 and was watched by millions. It portrayed Teresa as a living saint, Calcutta as hell on earth, and the missionaries of charity as angels bringing light to darkness. The dramatic framing, while perhaps oversimplifying complex realities, was undeniably effective storytelling. Muggeridge then wrote a book, also titled Something Beautiful for God, which became an international bestseller. He donated his royalties to Teresa's work, a generous gesture that also demonstrated the financial potential of Teresa's story. The book deal established a template. Writers and filmmakers could produce content about Teresa, reach large audiences, donate proceeds, and enhance their own reputations as sensitive observers of sanctity. Teresa became, in marketing terms, a brand. The white sari was her logo. The poorest of the poor was her tagline. Calcutta was her flagship location. And the message was love made visible, faith in action, proof that one person can change the world. This brand was immensely valuable. It attracted donations, volunteers, and institutional support. It provided protection from criticism. Attacking Mother Teresa seemed like attacking goodness itself, and it created permission for the missionaries of charity to operate in ways that other organizations could not. Consider how Teresa managed relationships with authoritarian governments. She met with Haiti's dictator Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier in 1981, accepting his Legion of Honor award and praising his love for the poor. This, while his regime systematically looted the country and violently suppressed opposition. She met with Albania's communist dictator Enver Hoxha in 1990, despite his regime's brutal persecution of religion. She met with Fidel Castro, with various military dictators in Latin America, with government officials whose human rights records were abysmal. Her position was consistent. She would work with any government that allowed her to serve the poor. She would not publicly criticize those in power, because criticism would result in expulsion, which would mean abandoning those she served. She prioritized access over advocacy. This calculation had logic. An expelled missionary helps no one. A silenced prophet serves no purpose. Better to work within constraints than to make heroic but futile gestures. And Teresa had no illusions about transforming political systems. That was not her mission. Her mission was to pick up dying people from streets, feed hungry children, care for the sick. If that required polite relationships with corrupt leaders, so be it. But this pragmatism had costs. When she praised dictators, it provided them propaganda value. When she remained silent about human rights abuses, it suggested these issues were less important than charitable work. When she accepted honors from oppressive regimes, it compromised her moral authority to speak about justice. And she did speak about justice, but selectively. She spoke passionately about abortion, calling it the greatest destroyer of peace, and using every platform to condemn it. She opposed contraception, divorce, and women's ordination. She advocated for traditional Catholic positions on sexuality and family. These positions were controversial, especially in Western countries where women's reproductive rights were expanding, but they were also strategically consistent with her Catholic identity and her relationship with the Vatican. Pope Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae in 1968 had reaffirmed church opposition to contraception, creating division within global Catholicism. Teresa's unambiguous support for church teaching aligned her with conservative Catholics and with the Vatican hierarchy. This alignment was valuable. It ensured continued institutional support, protected her from progressive critics within the church who might question her methods, and reinforced her image as authentically Catholic rather than merely humanitarian. The Nobel Peace Prize in 1979 represented the apex of Teresa's public recognition. The Norwegian Nobel Committee's decision to award the prize to a Catholic nun doing charitable work rather than to political leaders negotiating peace agreements was controversial. Critics argued that feeding the hungry, while admirable, was not peace work in the sense the prize intended, but the committee's reasoning was sophisticated. They argued that poverty created conditions for violence, that caring for the vulnerable reduced social tensions, that demonstrating love across religious and cultural boundaries built foundations for peace. Teresa's work, they suggested, addressed root causes of conflict, even if it did not negotiate treaties. For Teresa, the Nobel Prize was the ultimate platform. The award ceremony in Oslo in December 1979 was watched globally. Her acceptance speech became legendary. She declined the traditional formal banquet, requesting that the money be given to the poor instead. She spoke about abortion, about the poverty of loneliness, about seeing Christ in the suffering. She led the audience in prayer, an unprecedented moment at the secular Nobel ceremony. And she announced that the $192,000 prize money would go directly to helping the poorest of the poor. No administrative costs, no overhead, no institutional reserves, just immediate service. This gesture reinforced her brand perfectly. The saint who refused luxury, who converted every resource into direct aid, who cared nothing for personal recognition. The prize transformed Teresa from a respected religious figure into a global icon. She was now in the same category as Martin Luther King Jr., the Dalai Lama, Albert Schweitzer people, whose names represented moral authority transcending politics or religion. This status provided enormous influence, but also created vulnerability to criticism, because with global visibility came global scrutiny, and not everyone accepted the hagiographic narrative that had been constructed around her. By 1980, the Missionaries of Charity operated in more than 50 countries with over 1,000 sisters. Teresa was 70 years old, traveling constantly, managing an organization that had grown far beyond what she had imagined in 1948. The international expansion had succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. But success at this scale brings complexity. Managing operations across cultures and continents requires systems that Teresa's insistence on simplicity had not developed. Financial tracking across multiple countries and currencies requires accounting that her policy of opacity prevented. Quality control across hundreds of houses requires monitoring that her centralized authority could not provide. The seeds of future controversies were germinating in the very success of the enterprise. The model that worked brilliantly for a small operation in Calcutta was straining under global demands. The leadership style that inspired 12 followers showed limitations with 1,000. The financial practices that seemed admirably trusting when resources were minimal looked problematically unaccountable when donations reached millions of dollars annually. But in 1980, these problems were still latent. Teresa had built a global movement from nothing. She had proven that radical poverty, absolute faith, and simple love could transform lives across cultures. She had created an institution that would outlast her, or so it seemed. The empire of compassion had gone global. Now came the question, could it endure? In nature, successful species face a curious challenge. The very adaptations that allow explosive growth can become vulnerabilities. The peacock's magnificent tail attracts mates, but also predators. The oak tree's height captures sunlight but makes it a target for lightning. Success creates visibility, and visibility creates risk. By the 1980s, Mother Teresa faced this paradox. Her success had made her one of the most recognized people on earth. Her visibility had attracted resources beyond imagination. But that same visibility now attracted scrutiny, and not all of it was reverential. The decade began with consolidation. Teresa was 70 years old in 1980, and while her energy remained formidable, she could no longer personally oversee every house, meet every donor, or respond to every request. The organization needed systems that could function without her constant presence. She established regional training centers in Rome, Manila, San Francisco, and Tabora, Tanzania, where formation of new sisters could happen closer to their eventual assignments rather than requiring everyone to travel to Calcutta. This was practical necessity, but it also represented subtle decentralization. The template was now being replicated not just in practice, but in the training itself. She also began formalizing what had been informal. The Constitution of the Missionaries of Charity, the foundational document governing the order, was revised and submitted to Rome for official approval. This process required articulating in precise canonical language what had evolved organically. It meant codifying the charism, the spirit, the essential elements that could not be compromised. The Vatican's Congregation for Religious examined every detail. How were superiors elected? What were the criteria for admission? How were finances managed? What were the procedures for discipline? The bureaucratic scrutiny was exhausting but necessary. Without official approval, the missionaries of charity remained vulnerable to ecclesiastical politics, to a new bishop or cardinal deciding they did not fit proper religious life. Approval came, eventually, but the process revealed something important. Teresa's personal authority was being institutionalized. Her vision was becoming church law. After her death, sisters would be bound by constitutions rather than by her personal presence. This was both victory and limitation. The charism was preserved, but it was also frozen. The political landscape was shifting in ways that created both opportunities and challenges. The Cold War was entering its final decade, though no one knew this yet. Communist regimes that had been impenetrable were showing cracks, and Teresa, with her absolute anti-communism rooted in Albania's suppression of religion, saw opportunity. In 1982, she opened a house in East Berlin, extraordinary for a Catholic order in a communist state. The East German government, seeking Western approval and possibly Western currency, allowed limited religious activity. Teresa provided care for the elderly and disabled in ways the state system could not or would not. She was careful never to criticize the government publicly, maintaining the access over advocacy strategy that characterized her political approach. The real prize was Albania. Teresa had left Skopje in 1928, when her homeland was still recovering from centuries of Ottoman rule. Enver Hoxha's communist regime, which took power in 1944, had systematically destroyed religious life. Churches and mosques were demolished or converted to warehouses. Priests and imams were imprisoned or executed. By the 1970s, Albania had declared itself the world's first officially atheist state. Teresa had tried for decades to return to work. In the land of her birth, every request was denied. But Hoxha died in 1985, and by the late 1980s, even Albania was feeling pressure to reform. In 1990, as communist regimes collapsed across Eastern Europe, Teresa received permission to visit. She was 80 years old. She arrived in Tirana, the capital, to crowds who barely knew who she was. 40 years of state atheism had erased religious memory. She met with government officials, assessed needs, and within months established houses in Tirana and Shkodër. She was coming home, bringing her mission full circle. The expansion into former communist countries, Russia, Romania, Armenia, Georgia, accelerated through the early 1990s. These were societies with enormous needs and decimated social services. The missionaries of charity could establish presence quickly, work without government funding, and address desperate situations. They were filling vacuums left by collapsed state systems. But while Teresa was expanding in new territories, criticism was emerging in old ones. In 1994, The Lancet, one of the world's most prestigious medical journals, published an article by Dr. Robin Fox examining care at Nirmal Ride. Fox was sympathetic. He acknowledged the dedication of the sisters and the impossible circumstances they faced. But his observations were disturbing. Pain relief was inadequate. Patients in severe pain from terminal cancer received aspirin, but not morphine, despite morphine being inexpensive and available. Medical diagnosis was minimal. Patients were not informed of their conditions or prognoses. Needles were reused after only cursory cleaning, creating infection risk. Basic medical protocols were ignored. The focus seemed to be on providing spiritual comfort rather than medical care. Fox's critique was measured, but it raised fundamental questions. Why would an organization receiving millions of dollars in donations not provide proper pain management? Why would nurses trained in modern techniques accept practices that violated basic medical standards? Why would an order claiming to serve the poorest accept substandard care that would never be tolerated in Western hospitals? The response from the missionaries of charity was revealing. They did not dispute the facts. Instead, they explained their philosophy. Suffering had spiritual value. Pain could bring one closer to Christ. The dying were not merely patients, but were sharing in Jesus' crucifixion. Medical comfort was less important than spiritual preparation for death. This position, coherent within Catholic theology, was deeply troubling to modern medical ethics. It suggested that the sisters valued their own spiritual framework over patient autonomy and comfort. It raised the question, were they serving the poor, or were they using the poor to enact their religious vision? Then came Christopher Hitchens. Hitchens was a British-American journalist and polemicist known for intellectual combat and rhetorical brilliance. In 1994, he was commissioned by Channel 4 in Britain to produce a documentary examining Mother Teresa. The resulting film, Hell's Angel, was savage. Hitchens did not merely question methods or suggest improvements. He attacked the entire enterprise as fraudulent. He called Teresa a fanatic, a fundamentalist, and a fraud. He documented her acceptance of money from Charles Keating, a banker whose fraud had destroyed the savings of thousands. He revealed that she had written to a judge asking for leniency for Keating while refusing to return the stolen funds he had donated. He catalogued her meetings with dictators, her silence on human rights, her opposition to contraception in countries where overpopulation meant poverty. He questioned the financial opacity. The missionaries of charity claimed poverty but received tens of millions annually. Where was the money going? Why were facilities so poorly equipped if donations were so generous? Was money being diverted to church building or evangelization rather than care? His most incendiary claim was that Teresa was not actually interested in helping the poor. She was interested in promoting Catholic ideology and her own sanctity. The poor were props in her spiritual theatre. Their suffering was valuable to her not as something to alleviate but as something to display. Hitchens followed the documentary with a book, The Missionary Position, Mother Teresa, in Theory and Practice, which expanded his arguments with meticulous documentation. He dedicated himself to countering what he saw as uncritical hagiography, becoming Teresa's most persistent critic. The attacks created a crisis in reputation management. For decades, Teresa had been treated with reverence by journalists. Now she faced sustained, high-profile criticism. How should she respond? Her strategy was largely silence. She did not engage Hitchens directly. She did not hold press conferences defending her methods. She did not open financial records to prove transparency. Instead, she continued working, allowing her defenders to speak for her, trusting that visible service would counter abstract criticism. This approach had wisdom. Engaging critics gave them equal footing and suggested their arguments merited serious response. Defending specific decisions required explaining complex theological positions to secular audiences unlikely to find them convincing. Opening financial records set precedent that would require ongoing disclosure and accountability to outside authorities. But silence also had costs. It left allegations unanswered. It allowed narratives to harden without counter-evidence. It reinforced perceptions of opacity and suggested something to hide. The criticism revealed a fundamental tension in Teresa's project. Was the Missionaries of Charity a social service organization that should be judged by outcomes and efficiency? Or was it a religious order whose primary mission was spiritual rather than material, and which should be judged by faithfulness to religious values? Teresa would have said the second. Her mission was never merely to reduce suffering, but to recognize Christ in the suffering and to serve Christ through serving them. The quality of medical care was secondary to the quality of spiritual care. Efficiency metrics were irrelevant to a mission focused on love rather than outcomes, but she had accepted awards like the Nobel Peace Prize that judged her work by its social impact. She had solicited donations by highlighting the numbers: served children fed, dying people cared for, lepers treated. She had presented herself through media as solving problems addressing poverty, abandonment, disease. She had, in effect, claimed social service outcomes while maintaining religious service methods. This tension created vulnerability. If she was a social service provider, why were medical standards so poor? If she was a religious order focused on spiritual rather than material welfare, why accept awards and donations based on material impact? The health crises Teresa experienced through the 1980s and 90s added urgency to questions about succession and sustainability. She suffered her first major heart attack in 1989 in Rome, requiring hospitalization and pacemaker implantation. Another heart attack followed in 1991, then another in 1993. Each time, she recovered remarkably, but each time, the question became more pressing. What happens when she dies? In 1990, facing mortality clearly, Teresa attempted to resign as Superior General. She gathered the missionaries of charity for a special vote, expecting them to accept her resignation and elect a successor. The sisters voted overwhelmingly to reject her resignation. They wanted her to remain in charge. This revealed both her indispensability and its danger. The organization had grown so dependent on her authority, her vision, her ability to navigate complex situations, that the sisters could not imagine functioning without her. But this meant no one was being prepared for leadership. No succession plan was developed. No transfer of authority was practiced. Teresa withdrew her resignation and continued as Superior General. But the incident demonstrated that her leadership model, centralized, personal, charismatic, was creating an organization ill-equipped for transition. The financial management remained deliberately opaque throughout this period. The missionaries of charity never published financial statements. They never disclosed total donations received, total assets held, or how money was allocated. When asked, Teresa would say simply that God provided, that money appeared when needed, and that accounting details were not the public's concern. This opacity had different interpretations depending on perspective. Supporters saw it as spiritual trust and freedom from worldly concerns about money. Critics saw it as lack of accountability and possible mismanagement or diversion of funds. What is known is that donations were substantial. The order received money from individuals, foundations, governments, and corporations. Estimates suggested tens of millions of dollars annually by the 1990s, possibly more. This created a paradox. An organization devoted to poverty was managing enormous wealth. How was this money used? For establishing new houses, certainly each required some initial capital. For food, medicine, and basic supplies. For international travel, as Teresa and other leaders visited houses globally. For legal and administrative costs, and perhaps for other purposes: church building, evangelization, supporting other Catholic institutions. The lack of disclosure made it impossible to know. Some critics suggested that the low quality of care in missionaries of charity facilities, despite high donations, indicated that most money was being diverted elsewhere. Supporters countered that the needs were so vast that even millions of dollars, when spread across hundreds of houses serving thousands of people, was barely adequate. Without financial transparency, the truth remained elusive. but the opacity itself became evidence for those predisposed to suspicion. The final years of the 1990s saw Teresa increasingly frail but still active. She traveled to South Africa to meet Nelson Mandela. She opened houses in war-torn countries like Bosnia and Rwanda. She continued accepting awards and using them as platforms for her message. But the criticisms had fundamentally changed her public image. She was no longer simply the saint of the gutters. She was now a controversial figure, to some still a living saint, to others a problematic icon whose legacy was mixed at best. In 1997, she made her final public appearance at a Missionaries of Charity Profession ceremony in Calcutta. She was 87 years old, in a wheelchair, barely able to speak. But she was present, witnessing young women take vows to continue the work she had started 49 years earlier. Consider that moment. Nearly half a century had passed since Teresa stepped out of the Loreto convent with 5 rupees. She had built an organization operating in 133 countries with over 4,000 sisters. She had cared for countless individuals. The numbers were never precisely tallied, but certainly hundreds of thousands over the decades. She had attracted billions of dollars in donations. She had become one of the most recognized people in human history. And she had also created controversies that would outlast her. Questions about medical care, about financial management, about political relationships, about whether her methods actually served the poor or merely performed sanctity using the poor as props. Both things could be true. She could have genuinely loved the poor she served while also using that service to promote Catholic ideology. She could have built an effective organization while refusing accountability. She could have been both saint and flawed human, both prophet and calculating institution builder, both genuine mystic and savvy operator. The weight of sanctity, of being declared holy while still living, was crushing. Every action was interpreted through the lens of hagiography or iconoclasm. Nuance disappeared. She became either perfect or fraudulent, with little room for the complex reality that she was likely both dedicated and difficult, both inspired and problematic, both transformative and limited. As Teresa approached death, the question was not whether she had made an impact that was undeniable. The question was what that impact meant, whether it would endure, and how history would judge both the woman and the movement she had created. The empire of compassion had been built and consolidated, but empires must eventually face succession. And that moment was approaching faster than anyone wanted to acknowledge. There is a moment after every great life when memory begins its transformation into legend. Facts soften into story, contradictions smooth into coherence. The complicated human becomes the simplified symbol. This process is neither malicious nor accidental. It is how cultures preserve what they value, distilling essence from complexity. Mother Teresa died on September 5, 1997, of cardiac arrest at the Mother House in Calcutta. She was 87 years old. Her heart, which had failed repeatedly over the previous decade, finally stopped beating at 9:30 in the evening. The sisters who had cared for her these final years now prepared her body with the same gentle attention they had given to thousands of dying people on Calcutta's streets. The news spread with remarkable speed. Within hours, the world knew. Television programs interrupted regular broadcasting. Newspapers prepared special editions. Religious leaders issued statements. Politicians expressed condolences. The woman who had spent her life among the forgotten was remembered by everyone. India's response was immediate and extraordinary. Prime Minister Inder Kumar Gujral announced a state funeral, an honour typically reserved for heads of state and national heroes. This was remarkable recognition for a Catholic nun who was not Indian by birth, who had maintained religious identity separate from Hindu nationalism, and whose methods had been controversial even within India. But Gujral understood what Teresa had become. She was more than a religious figure, she was a symbol of India's humanitarian traditions, proof that the newly independent nation could produce global moral authority, evidence that Indian spirituality could manifest in Christian form. She had become, paradoxically, an Indian icon despite being Albanian, a Hindu symbol despite being Catholic, a secular saint despite her explicit religiosity. The state funeral on September 13th was attended by delegations from over 100 countries. The route from St. Thomas Church, where the funeral mass was held, to her burial place at the Mother House stretched for miles through Calcutta's streets. An estimated 1 million people lined the route. Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, standing together to honor a woman who had claimed to see Christ in each of them. The coffin was placed on the same gun carriage that had carried Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. This symbolic gesture was not lost on observers. Teresa was being positioned in India's pantheon of founding figures, alongside the political leaders who had created the modern nation. She had not negotiated independence or governed the country, but she had served its poorest citizens with dedication that matched any political achievement. Inside the missionaries of charity, the immediate question was succession. Teresa had served as Superior General for 47 years. Every decision had flowed through her. Every house had been established under her authority. Every sister had been trained according to her vision. The organization had never known any other leader. The Constitution required an election within 3 months of a Superior General's death. Sisters from around the world would gather in Calcutta to vote. This would be the first true test of whether Teresa had built an institution that could survive its founder, or merely a personality cult that would fragment without her presence. The sisters elected Sister Nirmala Joshi as the new Superior General in March 1998. The choice was revealing. Nirmala was Indian by birth. A Hindu convert to Catholicism, she represented the indigenization of Teresa's foreign-born mission. She was 63 years old, experienced, having served as superior in various locations. She was known for quiet competence rather than charismatic leadership. Most importantly, she represented continuity. Nirmala made clear that nothing would change the same white sari, the same vows, the same methods, the same spiritual approach. The missionaries of charity would continue exactly as Teresa had designed it. This was both reassuring and limiting. It ensured stability but prevented adaptation to changing circumstances or incorporation of lessons learned. Meanwhile, the Vatican was preparing for something unprecedented. Normally, the canonization process, the official recognition of someone as a saint, requires at least 5 years to pass after death before it can begin. This waiting period allows passions to cool, allows thorough investigation without pressure, and allows the person's legacy to clarify. Pope John Paul II had modified these rules during his papacy, accelerating canonizations as part of his strategy to provide the modern church with inspirational examples. But even by his standards, what happened next was extraordinary. In 1999, less than 2 years after Teresa's death, the Pope granted a dispensation, allowing her canonization process to begin immediately. This required exceptional justification, usually reserved for martyrs or in cases where delay would cause significant problems. The argument made was that Teresa's reputation for sanctity was so widespread, so universal, that waiting served no purpose. The world already knew she was holy. The canonization process has specific steps, each requiring detailed investigation and formal approval. First comes the diocesan investigation, gathering testimony from witnesses, collecting writings, examining reputation for holiness, and whether any theological errors were taught. This phase for Teresa was completed with remarkable speed, aided by the fact that she was already internationally known and extensively documented. Then the case moves to Rome, where the Congregation for the Causes of Saints examines everything. They look for heroic virtue. Did the person practice faith, hope, charity, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance to an extraordinary degree? They examine writings for orthodoxy. They investigate whether a cult has developed around the person that might complicate objective assessment. For Teresa, this investigation faced challenges. There were the criticisms from Hitchens and others about medical care and financial opacity. There were questions about relationships with dictators. There were concerns about whether opposition to contraception in overpopulated countries was prudent or harmful. But the investigators had a different framework. They were not evaluating Teresa as a social worker or development expert. They were evaluating her as a Catholic religious who lived her vows faithfully, served the Church obediently, and practiced charity heroically within Catholic teaching. From this perspective, controversies about methodology were secondary to questions about virtue. The critical requirement for beatification, the step before full canonization, is one verified miracle attributed to the candidate's intercession after death. The Catholic understanding is that saints in heaven can pray for those on earth, and God occasionally demonstrates their sanctity by working miracles through their prayers. The miracle proposed for Teresa's beatification occurred in 1998, 1 year after her death. Monica Bezra, a tribal woman from West Bengal, reported that she had been suffering from an abdominal tumor. On the first anniversary of Teresa's death, a Missionaries of Charity sister placed a medal blessed by Teresa on her abdomen and prayed. The next morning, the tumor had vanished. Medical documentation was gathered. Doctors who had examined her before and after testified. The Vatican's Medical Commission, composed of physicians who examine proposed miracles, investigated whether natural explanation was possible. They concluded that the healing was medically inexplicable based on available evidence. Critics immediately raised questions. Monica Bezra's husband claimed she had been receiving medical treatment and that doctors had prescribed medication that likely cured her. The attending physicians disagreed among themselves about whether this was truly miraculous. Some suggested it was spontaneous regression, rare but documented in medical literature. But the Vatican standard is not absolute certainty, it is whether the healing is scientifically inexplicable and whether it occurred in the context of prayer to the candidate. By these criteria, Monica Bezra's healing qualified. Pope John Paul II beatified Mother Teresa on October 19, 2003, in St. Peter's Square before a crowd of 300,000 people. She was now Blessed Teresa of Calcutta, one step away from full sainthood. The beatification ceremony was celebration but also assertion. The Church was declaring that despite controversies, despite criticisms, despite questions about methods, Teresa had lived a life of heroic Christian virtue worthy of veneration. This was not merely historical judgment, it was theological and political statement about what the Church valued and how it responded to secular criticism. Then came an unexpected revelation. In 2007, a book titled Mother Teresa, Come Be My Light was published, containing previously private correspondence between Teresa and her spiritual directors. The letters revealed something startling. For nearly 50 years, from shortly after founding the Missionaries of Charity until her death, Teresa had experienced profound spiritual darkness. She described feeling abandoned by God, sensing no divine presence in prayer, experiencing what mystics call the dark night of the soul, but sustained over decades rather than months. She wrote, "I feel just that terrible pain of loss, of God not wanting me, of God not being God, of God not really existing." This revelation could have damaged her reputation. Here was the woman celebrated for radical faith, admitting she felt no sense of God's presence. Here was the mystic who claimed to see Christ in the poor, confessing she felt spiritually empty. How could someone who doubted God's existence be a saint? But the Vatican and Teresa's supporters reframed the revelation brilliantly. They argued that her spiritual darkness made her holiness more profound, not less. She had served faithfully despite feeling abandoned, had continued her mission without emotional consolation, had loved without feeling loved in return. This was heroic faith, not faith when God felt close, but faith maintained through absolute darkness. The spiritual darkness also positioned Teresa in the tradition of mystics like Saint John of the Cross and Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, who had described similar experiences. It gave her theological credentials beyond mere charitable work. She was not just someone who helped the poor, she was someone who had undergone mystical suffering while helping the poor. The second miracle required for full canonization was identified in 2008. Marcílio Haddad Andrino, a Brazilian man suffering from multiple brain tumors and in a coma, was prayed over by his family and friends who asked Mother Teresa's intercession. He recovered completely, with no medical explanation for the healing. Again, skeptics questioned whether this was truly miraculous or simply the unpredictable course of serious illness, where some patients recover against expectations. Again, the Vatican's medical commission examined the case and concluded it qualified as scientifically inexplicable. Pope Francis canonized Mother Teresa on September 4, 2016, the day before the 19th anniversary of her death. The ceremony in St. Peter's Square was attended by over 100,000 people, including 1,500 homeless people who were given special seating, a gesture acknowledging Teresa's life work. Francis's homily was carefully crafted. He acknowledged that, perhaps, some people thought Teresa had merely done social work, but insisted she had been motivated entirely by love of God, made visible through love of the poor. He praised her defense of life in all its stages, an obvious reference to her opposition to abortion. He positioned her as model of mercy in a church he was trying to make more welcoming. The canonization completed Teresa's official transformation from complicated human to simplified saint. Her feast day was set as September 5th, the anniversary of her death. Churches could now be dedicated to her. Children could be baptized with her name as a baptismal name. She was officially in heaven, capable of interceding for those who prayed to her. But canonization also froze her in time. The Catholic Church cannot revise canonizations. Once declared a saint, always a saint. This means that future discoveries about Teresa's life or work, future reassessments of her methods or choices, cannot change her official status. Whatever questions remain about financial management, medical care quality, or political relationships are now theological irrelevant from the Church's perspective. The speed of Teresa's canonization 19 years from death to official sainthood reflected several factors beyond mere evaluation of her individual virtue. She was canonized during a period when the Church faced severe criticism over sexual abuse scandals, declining attendance in Western countries, and challenges maintaining relevance in secular societies. Having a contemporary saint, someone recently alive, whose work was visible and documented, provided the Church with positive narrative and inspirational figure. She was also useful politically. Her absolute opposition to abortion and contraception aligned perfectly with Church teaching at a time when these positions were under social pressure. Her traditional understanding of religious obedience and hierarchical authority reinforced institutional structures. Her example of joyful poverty and service provided answer to those who criticized church wealth and comfort. The canonization was not merely recognition of Teresa personally, it was endorsement of what she represented and validation of the missionaries of charity's approach. It declared that their methods, despite criticisms, were not only acceptable but exemplary. It said that spiritual care was more important than medical standards, that accepting suffering had value beyond alleviating it, that poverty chosen voluntarily was more holy than development that eliminated poverty. Back in Calcutta, at the mother house where Teresa had lived and died, her tomb became a pilgrimage site. People of all faiths visited, lighting candles, leaving prayers, asking intercession for their troubles. The sisters maintained the room exactly as she had left it, preserving personal items as relics. The missionaries of charity continued operating under Nirmala's leadership until 2009, when she was succeeded by Sister Mary Prema Pierik. The organization maintained its size, about 5,000 sisters, in over 130 countries, without significant expansion or contraction. It continued the same work in the same way, a living monument to its founder's vision. Consider what had been accomplished through the canonization process. A controversial figure had been rendered uncontroversial through official sanctification. Questions that might have continued troubling her legacy were theologically neutralized. Her methods were validated, her choices affirmed, her holiness certified. But consider also what was lost. The complex, driven, sometimes difficult woman who built something extraordinary through sheer will, she disappeared into the simplified saint. The strategic thinker who cultivated relationships and managed image, she vanished into the humble servant who merely trusted God. The human being who made questionable choices alongside heroic ones, she was replaced by the icon who was always right because she was always holy. The empire of compassion had survived its founder's death and secured its future through her canonization. What began with 5 rupees and absolute conviction had become a global institution with a canonized saint as its eternal foundation. Whether this was triumph or tragedy, preservation or calcification, depended entirely on what one believed mattered most, the work itself, or the way the work was understood and remembered. In the natural world, we measure success by survival and propagation. The oak tree that lives 300 years and produces millions of acorns is successful. The salmon that reaches spawning grounds and releases thousands of eggs is successful. But with human endeavors, the metrics become infinitely more complex. How do we measure the success of a life? By longevity of institutions created? By number of people directly served? By ideas spread and cultural impact? By alignment between stated values and actual outcomes? Mother Teresa has been gone for more than a quarter century now. Enough time has passed for initial emotions, both reverential and critical, to settle into something approaching historical perspective. We can now ask with some clarity, what did she actually accomplish? What endures? What lessons emerge from both her successes and her failures? The institutional legacy is unambiguous. The missionaries of charity continue operating in approximately 139 countries, with roughly 5,000 sisters. This is extraordinary organizational persistence. Most founder-led movements fragment or fade within a generation of the founder's death. Teresa built something that has successfully transitioned through multiple leaders while maintaining operational presence across continents. The model she created, extreme simplicity, zero cost to recipients, sister labor rather than paid staff, focus on direct service rather than systemic intervention, has proven remarkably durable. It works as well in 2025 as it did in 1950. This durability comes from the model's elegant adaptation to a specific niche, providing immediate relief to people falling through all other social safety nets. Walk into a Missionaries of Charity house today, anywhere in the world, and you will find essentially what Teresa established 75 years ago. Sisters in white saris, rising before dawn for prayer. Simple meals of rice and vegetables eaten on the floor. Minimal furnishings. No television, no internet, no smartphones. And steady, patient service to whoever arrives, needing help feeding the hungry, washing the sick, sitting with the dying, caring for abandoned children. This continuity is simultaneously the organization's greatest strength and its most significant limitation. The strength: absolute clarity of mission, perfect consistency across locations, zero mission drift from original vision. The limitation: inability to adapt to changing circumstances, resistance to learning from experience, refusal to incorporate improved methods, even when available, at minimal cost. Consider pain management. In 1994, The Lancet documented inadequate pain relief at Nirmal Ride. 3 decades later, this remains largely unchanged. Morphine is inexpensive and legal in India. Modern pain management protocols are well established. But the missionaries of charity maintain their approach, rooted in theological belief that suffering has spiritual value. One can respect this as theological consistency while simultaneously recognizing it as medical failure. The organization serves its spiritual mission precisely, but its social service outcomes remain limited by refusal to adopt available improvements. The financial sustainability is another area of mixed assessment. The missionaries of charity continue receiving substantial donations. Estimates suggest tens of millions of dollars annually, though exact figures remain undisclosed. This financial stream shows no sign of diminishing. Teresa's brand value persists. Her canonization, if anything, enhanced it. But the financial opacity that characterized Teresa's leadership continues. The organization still does not publish financial statements, does not disclose total assets, does not provide detailed accounting of how donations are used. This lack of transparency would be unacceptable for most modern charities operating at this scale. Yet the missionaries of charity maintain it without apparent consequence. From a strategic perspective, this opacity has advantages. It prevents donor fatigue that might come from seeing how much money accumulates versus how simply facilities operate. It prevents comparison with other organizations' efficiency metrics. It maintains mystique about resources appearing providentially rather than through calculated fundraising. But it also prevents learning, accountability, and optimization. Without financial data, no one can assess whether resources are allocated effectively, whether some programs should be expanded and others reduced, whether the model delivers maximum impact per dollar donated. The direct service impact, the number of individual lives touched, is impossible to quantify precisely because the organization has never prioritized such measurement. Certainly, hundreds of thousands of people over 75 years have received food, medical care, shelter, or comfort from the missionaries of charity. For many of these individuals, this intervention was life-saving or life-changing. But we must also ask, what did not happen because resources went here rather than elsewhere? If the millions of dollars donated to the missionaries of charity had instead gone to organizations focused on systemic poverty reduction, primary healthcare systems, education, or economic development, would more people have benefited more substantially? This is not a question with definitive answer. It reflects different philosophies about charity and justice. Teresa's approach was personal and immediate. See someone suffering, relieve that suffering right now. She was not trying to eliminate poverty's root causes, was not attempting to reform unjust systems, was not pursuing long-term development. She was providing emergency response, triage, dignity in crisis. One can argue this is insufficient, that real compassion requires addressing why people end up dying on streets, not merely making their deaths more comfortable. Or one can argue this is profound, that every person deserves to be seen, touched, and loved, regardless of whether their circumstances can be changed. Both positions have validity, and Teresa's legacy contains both. The cultural impact extends far beyond the organization itself. Teresa demonstrated that one person with clarity of purpose could build something global, starting from nothing. She proved that radical poverty, when chosen voluntarily, could be powerful rather than limiting. She showed that women could lead large organizations and command international respect, even in patriarchal religious structures. She also, whether intentionally or not, shaped global perceptions about poverty, service, and sanctity. Her image, the white sari, the lined face, the gentle hands touching suffering bodies, became the visual representation of selfless service. This image inspired countless people to engage in charitable work, to serve their communities, to recognize human dignity in the marginalized. But the same image also created problems. It suggested that proper response to poverty was individual charity rather than systemic change. It implied that the poor should be grateful for whatever they receive, rather than demanding just treatment as rights-bearing citizens. It reinforced savior narratives where privileged people rescue unfortunate others rather than addressing power structures that create and maintain inequality. The question of whether Teresa helped or hindered long-term poverty reduction remains debated. Did her work provide necessary emergency relief while others addressed systemic issues? Or did her high visibility and resource absorption divert attention and funding from more effective interventions? The honest answer is probably both, in complex interplay impossible to fully untangle. Teresa's opposition to contraception and abortion had real-world consequences that must be assessed as part of her legacy. She used every platform, Nobel Prize acceptance speech, audiences with world leaders, interviews with international media to advocate these positions. In countries where access to family planning could have reduced maternal mortality, where limiting family size could have improved children's nutrition and education, her voice reinforced policies that maintained suffering she claimed to want to alleviate. One can hold that she was theologically consistent and ethically wrong simultaneously. Her positions flowed logically from Catholic teaching about the sanctity of human life from conception. But they also meant more children born into poverty that would kill them, more women dying in childbirth, more families unable to provide adequate care. This is legacy too, not merely the people she directly served, but the people her advocacy affected, for better or worse. The saint or fraud debate that emerged in the 1990s has not been resolved by canonization. If anything, the official declaration of her sanctity has sharpened the division. For Catholics and many others, she is definitively holy, her choices validated by church authority and divine approval manifested through miracles. For critics, she remains problematic at best, fraudulent at worst, someone who performed sanctity while accepting questionable donations, maintaining poor care standards, and using the poor as props for religious ideology. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that she was neither purely saint nor purely fraud, but rather a deeply driven human being who built something remarkable through force of will, strategic intelligence, and absolute commitment. She made choices, some admirable, some questionable, some whose moral status depends entirely on one's ethical framework. She succeeded spectacularly in her stated mission, while failing to achieve outcomes that others think should have been priorities. The ultimate strategic achievement was transforming herself, an Albanian teacher in an Irish order working in Calcutta, into a global icon whose name became synonymous with selfless service. This required not just dedication but also shrewd understanding of media, politics, and institutional dynamics. It required building alliances, managing image, and navigating complex systems while maintaining appearance of simple faith and trust. Whether one admires or critiques this achievement depends on what one values, the service itself or the systems that enabled the service, the immediate relief of suffering or the structural changes that would prevent suffering, the spiritual witness or the practical outcomes. Imagine witnessing this story unfold from beginning to end. A young woman leaving security for uncertainty, teaching street children under a tree, gradually building an organization that would eventually operate on 6 continents. Imagine watching her receive the Nobel Prize, knowing that back in Calcutta, people were still dying on streets despite decades of her work. Imagine seeing the controversies emerge, the criticisms intensify, the canonization proceed regardless. What would you conclude? That dedication and love can transform the world? That good intentions without systemic thinking are insufficient? That both are true? The missionaries of charity continue their work today, much as they did 75 years ago. They will likely continue for decades more, barring major institutional crisis. Teresa's canonization ensures her name and mission will be remembered for centuries within Catholic tradition. But memory and impact are different things. The Roman Empire is remembered far longer than it existed, but its impact, the roads, the laws, the languages it shaped, those are what truly endure beyond memory. What endures from Teresa's empire of compassion? The organization, certainly, for now, the inspiration to countless individuals to serve rather than merely accumulate, the demonstration that simplicity has power, that poverty can be chosen strength rather than imposed weakness, that individual action matters even when systemic change seems impossible, but also the lesson that good intentions without accountability create problems, that visibility is not the same as effectiveness, that fame can become self-perpetuating regardless of actual results, that institutions built around charismatic founders face succession challenges. Both sets of lessons matter. Both are part of the legacy. In the end, perhaps the most important question is not whether Mother Teresa was saint or fraud, success or failure, hero or problematic icon. Perhaps the question is, what can we learn from her example about service, about organization building, about the relationship between spiritual conviction and practical outcomes, about the dangers and opportunities of fame, about the complex relationship between helping individuals and changing systems? She built something from nothing through absolute commitment. That is remarkable. She maintained theological consistency, even when it meant accepting suffering that could have been alleviated. That is troubling. She created an institution that has survived decades beyond her death. That is impressive. She resisted accountability and transparency that might have improved outcomes. That is problematic. All of these things are true. None of them cancels the others out. The measure of her life, finally, is not a single number or simple verdict. It is the complex accumulation of millions of interactions between sisters and suffering people, billions of dollars donated and spent, thousands of sisters whose lives were shaped by her vision, and millions of people worldwide whose understanding of service, poverty, and sanctity were influenced by her example. She lived 87 years. She spent 69 of them as a nun, 47 leading the missionaries of charity. She built an organization that continues serving nearly 30 years after her death. She became one of the most recognized people of the 20th century. She died surrounded by sisters she had trained, in the house where she had worked, still wearing the white sari she had adopted 49 years earlier. That life, in all its complexity and contradiction, in all its achievement and limitation, in all its inspiration and controversy, that is what endures. Not the simplified saint of popular imagination, not the fraud of critic caricature, but the complicated, driven, strategic, mystical, effective, limited, holy, problematic human being who decided that 5 rupees and absolute conviction were enough to begin. And perhaps, finally, that is enough. Not perfection, but presence. Not comprehensive solution, but faithful response. Not the end of suffering, but the witness that suffering is seen, that the person suffering matters, that love, however limited, however complicated, is offered. The empire of compassion was built. The measure of its success belongs to history, which has not yet finished its assessment.